I don't think I could do this anymore. I don't know why, but I'm okay with walking away from this because there's no way I'm dragging down the legacy.
There are moments in live music that nobody in the room ever forgets, not because they were the best moments, but because they were the most human ones. The night when something went wrong that could not be hidden, when a performer standing under the lights stopped being a legend for a moment and became just a person in pain, trying to hold on. That is exactly what happened inside Madison Square Garden on the night of July 23rd, 2026, when Jon Bon Jovi walked in front of the stage, placed his hand over his chest, and told 20,000 people that he could not continue. The crowd that had come to witness a triumphant comeback instead witnessed something far more complicated and far more revealing. And to understand why that moment happened, you have to go back much further than that single night. You have to go back more than a decade to when the real story quietly began. Jon Bon Jovi built one of the most durable careers in the history of rock music, from the streets of Sayreville, New Jersey, where he recorded his first demos as a teenager, to arenas across every continent. He constructed a legacy on the foundation of relentless work and an almost stubborn refusal to accept limitations. Bon Jovi, the band, sold more than 130 million records worldwide. They survived the collapse of the hair metal era that swallowed most of their contemporaries. They survived lineup changes, cultural shifts, and decades of evolving music industry economics. Jon himself became one of the most recognizable voices in popular music, a voice that carried a specific kind of emotional directness that connected with audiences across generations. That voice was not just his instrument, it was his identity. And for more than a decade before that July night at Madison Square Garden, something was slowly going wrong with it. The chain of events that ultimately led to that stage can be traced back to 2013, during the Because We Can tour. That was the year guitarist Richie Sambora, one of the founding members of Bon Jovi and Jon's vocal partner for 3 decades, abruptly departed the band midway through the tour. Sambora later explained his exit in terms of family priorities and personal struggles he needed to address. But his absence created a problem that extended far beyond the obvious gap in guitar playing. Sambora had always been the other half of Bon Jovi's vocal architecture. The harmonies he provided were woven into the fabric of how the band's songs were built and performed live. When he left, Jon was left to carry approximately 80 remaining tour dates largely on his own, covering not just his own vocal parts, but the harmonic layers that Sambora had always handled. He was, in effect, singing for 2 people night after night, in arenas without rest. Jon later reflected in interviews that the damage he sustained during that period was the starting point for everything that followed, and that he could not tell at the time whether what he was experiencing was physical or psychological. As it turned out, it was very much physical, and it was getting worse. By 2015, the changes in his voice were becoming difficult to conceal from audiences who knew his work well. A breathiness that had not been there before, moments where volume that once came effortlessly now required visible effort. Patches of performance where the instrument simply did not respond the way it once had. Jon has spoken candidly about this period in multiple interviews and in the Hulu documentary series Thank You, Good Night, describing an experience of trying everything medically and holistically available to him in an attempt to fix something he could feel slipping away. Laser treatments, acupuncture, vitamins, collagen injections, specialized vocal exercises. He pursued every possible avenue while continuing to tour through 2015, 2017, and 2019, pushing through shows while the underlying problem was being left unaddressed because nobody had yet identified what it actually was. The physical demands of performing 4 nights a week, belting out stadium anthems at the volume that audiences expected from Bon Jovi, were continuing to wear on a voice that was already damaged and declining. The pandemic shutdowns of 2020 and 2021 forced every touring musician off the road. For some artists, the enforced break provided genuine rest and restoration. For Jon, the 2 years away from touring only made the condition of his voice more visible by removing the adrenaline and performance momentum that had helped mask how serious the problem had become. When the band began preparing to return to live performance in 2022, the gap between where his voice had been and where it now was could no longer be explained away or worked around. The truth of what had been happening for nearly a decade was becoming impossible to ignore. The moment that forced the crisis into the open came after a show in Nashville in 2022. Jon came offstage feeling, by his own account, that he had given the audience something real. He turned to his wife Dorothea and told her he thought it had gone well. What she said back to him changed everything. She told him it had not been great, and that she had seen him be great. Dorothea and Jon have been together since their high school years in New Jersey. They married in 1989, and she has been present for every chapter of one of rock music's most sustained careers. Jon has described her in interviews, including a conversation with People magazine, as the one person in his entire world who would never give him false reassurance. Everyone else in the orbit of a major rock star, he explained, is either a paid employee, a yes man, or a devoted fan who desperately wants you to be brilliant. Dorothea was none of those things. She was the person who loved him enough to tell him the truth, when telling him the truth was the hardest possible thing to do. And when he heard her words, his immediate internal response, as he later shared publicly, was that it was time to retire. Not time to see a specialist. Not time to rest and try again. His first instinct was that his career as a performing artist was finished. That instinct reveals the enormous psychological weight he'd been carrying through years of feeling his voice change beneath him. Instead of accepting that conclusion, Jon drove himself to the hospital. He went alone, without an assistant or a manager, because the urgency of what he needed to find out was too immediate to wait for arrangements to be made around him. When the doctors examined his vocal cords and showed him what they found, the reality was worse than anything he had allowed himself to imagine. One of his vocal cords had atrophied severely. He described it in the Hulu documentary with precise and unsettling language. The two cords, which had run parallel to each other at roughly the same thickness, were wildly mismatched. One had swollen significantly, while the other had diminished to the point where the stronger cord was physically pushing the weaker one aside every time he attempted to sing. The weakened cord, in his own words, was dying. The doctors explained that some degree of vocal fold thinning is a natural consequence of aging, but that 4 decades performing at the intensity Jon had sustained had accelerated the deterioration far beyond what time alone would have caused. Jon was genuinely stunned by this, because he had been meticulous about vocal care his entire career. He had never smoked. He had always warmed up before performances and cooled down afterward. He had trained seriously as a singer, had performed alongside operatic voices, including Luciano Pavarotti, and had approached his craft with the discipline of someone who understood that a voice is a fragile instrument that requires constant maintenance. None of it had been enough to prevent what the doctors were showing him. The surgical procedure that followed was called medialization. Surgeons placed 2 small pieces of Gore-Tex material on the outside of the vocal cords, inside the neck, designed to push the atrophied cord back into proper alignment, so that both sides could vibrate in symmetry again. Jon described the procedure in the documentary as something like a facelift for the vocal cords. The surgery itself was technically successful. What followed was a rehabilitation process that would stretch across nearly 3 years and would test him in ways that no tour or recording schedule ever had. 19 months after the operation, he still could not commit to performing live. The band had completed a new album, but the question of whether their frontman would ever stand on a stage again remained genuinely unanswered. In an interview with the Sunday Times published in April 2024, Jon spoke with a candor that shook his fan base. He said that if his voice could not return to a level he considered worthy of his audience, he was prepared to walk away and was at peace with that decision. He referenced the danger of performing past the point of honesty, using a pointed phrase about not wanting to become the diminished version of a once great performer playing for the sentiment of who they used to be rather than who they still were. That interview made clear that he understood exactly what was at stake and had thought carefully about where his limits were. Through all of this, the other members of Bon Jovi remained. Drummer Tico Torres, keyboardist David Bryan, and the rest of the band's live lineup showed up for every rehearsal, maintained their commitment to the project, and gave Jon stability of knowing the group will be there whenever and if ever he was ready. Jon described their loyalty in a People magazine interview in June 2026 with genuine emotion, saying that what each of them had sacrificed during the years of uncertainty was something he would never stop honoring. Even Richie Sambora, absent from the band since 2013, publicly indicated in an interview on the Allison Hagendorf show that he would be open to returning if Jon recovered and circumstances allowed. That statement carried particular weight given the history, and it underlined just how significant this moment was within the larger arc of the band's story. In October 2025, Jon announced what he was calling the Forever Tour, anchored by a 9-night residency at Madison Square Garden beginning in July 2026. The announcement was met with enormous enthusiasm, and the shows sold out quickly. When the first night arrived on July 7th, Jon opened with cover arrangement with a little help from my friends, a choice so deliberately weighted with meaning that it required no explanation. For years after his last live performance, after surgery and therapy and sustained doubt, he was standing on a stage again asking for exactly what the lyrics described. The reviews from the opening nights acknowledged honestly that his voice was changed, that it carried the marks of what he'd been through, but that he was delivering full performances and managing the demands of lengthy set lists. For someone who had wondered aloud whether he would ever perform again, the accomplishment was real, and the response from audiences was overwhelming. What happened over the subsequent shows, however, told a more complicated story. A schedule of 9 performances inside 3 weeks is demanding for any vocalist. For a 64-year-old singer whose vocal cords are supported by surgical implants and who spent years in rehabilitation rebuilding the most basic capacities of his instrument, it represented a significant physical challenge. By the 6th and 7th shows, the strain was becoming audible and visible. Songs that placed the heaviest demands on the upper register began disappearing from the set list without public explanation. The band and their team were clearly monitoring the situation carefully, but the trajectory was not moving in the right direction. On the night of July 23rd, the 8th show of the residency, what had been a concerning trend became an unavoidable reality. From the opening song, the audience could sense that something was wrong. The voice that had been threading its way through the demands of the previous shows was now audibly struggling in ways that could not be attributed to a single difficult night. The band played 14 songs when a normal show in his residency ran to over 20. When they reached one of the most beloved songs in their catalog, Jon stepped back from the microphone and let the crowd carry the vocal because he could not. Before the final song of the night, he addressed the audience directly. He told them he knew he was letting them down, that it was not like him to do that he was hurting badly and needed their help. Pat Monahan of Train, who happened to be in the arena that night as a private audience member with no scheduled involvement in the show, was brought backstage and came out to help carry the final song, while Jon leaned on the crowd to fill in what his voice could not deliver. When the song ended, Jon told the audience to hold on to their ticket stubs because he would find a way to make it right. He embraced each of his bandmates individually, acknowledged the crowd one final time, and walked off the stage. His representatives confirmed afterward that he had been dealing with a sinus infection, and that statement was accurate as far as it went. But the context stretching back through more than a decade of vocal decline, surgery, rehabilitation, and the enormous physical demands of this comeback schedule is what gives that night its true weight. This was not a performer abandoning his audience over something minor. This was a man who had already spent years fighting to preserve the ability to stand on that stage at all, who had drawn a clear line about the standard he would hold himself to, and who honored that line even when the cost of doing so was stopping in front of 20,000 people. The remaining dates on the Forever Tour, including the final Madison Square Garden show and the European Stadium dates scheduled through September, were still listed publicly in the days following the cancellation. The financial and emotional stakes attached to those shows for the band and for fans who had planned travel from around the world were enormous. But Jon Bon Jovi had already told the world in 2024 exactly how he would navigate a moment like this one. He said he would not perform diminished work out of obligation or ego. He said he refused to become a performer coasting on the audience's memory of who he once was. What happened on July 23rd was not a collapse of the comeback. It was evidence that the man meant every word he said.